If North Carolina carries out her sentence, Blanche Taylor Moore, now 92 years old, will become the oldest woman ever executed in United States history. In this story, we will reveal the chilling trail of bodies she left behind, the lies she told to cover them up, and the decades she has spent waiting to die. At 10:15 in the morning on April 13, 1989, Dr. Lucas Wong stood at the nurses' station at North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill, staring at a toxicology report he couldn't believe. He read it once, then twice. Then he picked up the phone. "Get security," he said, "and call the police." 3 floors below, in room 358, a 56-year-old pastor named Dwight Moore lay dying. For days, he had suffered relentless vomiting. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Paralysis was creeping slowly up his limbs, and his breathing had become shallow and labored. Doctors had been baffled, running test after test, trying to understand what was killing him. At the foot of his bed sat his new bride of just 2 weeks, Blanche. Perfect hair, calm voice, hands clasped in prayer. She told every nurse who asked the same thing. He was working with herbicide last week. Maybe he inhaled something? I just don't understand it. But Dr. Wong had ordered one final test, a toxicology screen for heavy metals. And when the results came back, the room fell silent. Dwight had 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic in his system. It was the highest level the hospital had ever seen in a living patient, and somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. When investigators arrived and gently questioned Dwight between bouts of vomiting, he said something that sent a chill through everyone in the room. "You need to look at Blanche's past," he whispered. "Her last boyfriend, Raymond, he died from the same symptoms." That single sentence triggered a chain reaction that would expose one of America's quietest serial killers. Exhumations, forensic tests, a trail of bodies stretching back decades. And at the center of it all, a church-going grandmother who insisted, even as the evidence mounted, that she had done nothing wrong. But Blanche's story doesn't begin in that hospital room. It begins years earlier, in a home dominated by fear, scripture, and secrets no one dared speak aloud. According to investigators, Blanche Taylor Moore's case would become one of the most disturbing they had ever worked. At first, doctors thought Dwight's symptoms looked like pesticide poisoning, something environmental, accidental. But what they didn't realize at the time was that every meal he had eaten in the days before his collapse had been prepared by Blanche. According to Blanche, Dwight had been doing yard work and must have been exposed to chemicals. She seemed genuinely concerned, visiting him every day, bringing him home-cooked meals, even while he lay hospitalized. She prayed by his bedside. She reassured the nurses. She played the role of the devoted wife perfectly. But the story began falling apart almost immediately. The herbicide theory didn't make sense. Dwight's symptoms were too precise, too concentrated. Arsenic poisoning has a signature: neurological damage, paralysis, gastrointestinal distress, and Dwight's case matched it perfectly. Then there was the timing. Blanche had married him on March 25th. By April 4th, he was in the hospital. By April 13th, doctors had discovered the arsenic. And when investigators started asking questions, they discovered something even more disturbing. Blanche had tried to change Dwight's pension beneficiary during his hospitalization. She did it without telling him. She also had his hair cut off before investigators could test it for arsenic. When asked why, she said it was dirty. Everything felt too convenient, too rehearsed, too controlled. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Investigators pulled Dwight's medical records and noticed something odd. He had mentioned a man named Raymond Reed, someone from Blanche's past who had died under eerily similar circumstances. When they looked into Reed's death, they found he had suffered the same neurological decline, the same paralysis, the same mysterious illness. Doctors at the time had blamed it on Guillain-Barré syndrome, but they had never tested for arsenic. Within days, investigators were digging deeper into Blanche's history. What they uncovered was a pattern that stretched back decades, a series of sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, and grieving moments that always seemed to benefit Blanche in one way or another. Her first husband, James Taylor, had died in 1973. Cause of death, heart attack. Her father, Parker Kaiser, had died in 1966. Also ruled a heart attack. Her longtime lover, Raymond Reed, had died in 1986 after months of unexplained illness. And now Dwight Moore, her brand new husband, was barely clinging to life with arsenic coursing through his veins. One by one, investigators requested exhumations, and one by one, the bodies told the same story. But the final blow came from the hospital itself. Buried in Raymond Reed's old medical files, investigators found a toxicology test that had been ordered years earlier. Take your memory, back when he was still alive. The test had come back positive for arsenic, but somehow it had never been passed up the chain of command. It had been filed away and forgotten. Raymond Reed had been poisoned. The doctors had known, and no one had stopped it. Piece by piece, the case against Blanche Taylor Moore began to take shape. And what emerged was the portrait of a woman who had learned decades earlier that arsenic was invisible, nearly undetectable, and devastatingly effective. But what really happened in those homes, and how did a church-going grandmother, beloved by neighbors and trusted by family, manage to kill again and again without anyone noticing? The answer lay in her past, in the fractured childhood, the violent father, the years of abuse and control that had shaped her into someone capable of murder with a smile. In the days after Dwight's poisoning was confirmed, Detective Samuel Taylor from the Alamance County Sheriff's Office sat across from Blanche in a small interrogation room. She wore a modest floral dress and kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. When he asked her to explain what had happened, she didn't hesitate. Dwight was doing yard work, she said calmly. He must have been exposed to something. Herbicide, maybe pesticides. I warned him to be careful. But when pressed about the arsenic specifically, her story shifted. Well, we did eat at a barbecue restaurant the night before he got sick, she added. Maybe the food was contaminated. You hear about those things happening? Detective Taylor made a note. Then he asked about Dwight's previous health. Blanche paused, then offered something new. You know, she said softly, my first husband, James, he died suddenly too. I've always wondered if he might have done something to himself. Depression runs in families. The detective's pen stopped moving. Over the following week, investigators discovered a pattern that made Blanche's explanations impossible to believe. Hospital records showed that Blanche had delivered meals to Dwight's bedside constantly. Home-cooked chicken, casseroles, desserts. More than 50 nurses remembered seeing her. She never missed a day, and every time she visited, Dwight's condition worsened. Then came the financial records. On April 11th, while Dwight was barely conscious, Blanche had visited the hospital administrator's office and requested paperwork to change his pension beneficiary from his daughter to herself. When confronted, she said she was just trying to help organize his affairs. But the most disturbing discovery came from the barber. Blanche had called him to the hospital on April 12th to cut Dwight's hair. She insisted it was filthy and needed to be trimmed immediately. Investigators later realized she had done it the day before they planned to collect hair samples for arsenic testing. Detective Taylor began pulling files. Every death connected to Blanche Taylor Moore, and what he found made his blood run cold. To understand how Blanche Taylor Moore became capable of murder, investigators had to look back, far beyond the hospital room, beyond the trail of bodies, to a childhood marked by darkness and control. Blanche Kaiser was born in 1933 in rural North Carolina, the daughter of Parker Kaiser, a man who wore two faces. To the church congregation, he was a Baptist preacher, a man of God who could quote scripture with fire and conviction. But inside the walls of their home, he was something else entirely. Parker Kaiser was an alcoholic, a gambler, and according to Blanche's own testimony years later, a predator. She would claim, quietly during interviews long after her arrest, that her father had forced her into unspeakable acts, that he had used her to pay off gambling debts when money ran short, that violence and scripture were twisted together in their home, inseparable and suffocating. Neighbors who knew the family remembered Blanche as a strange, contradictory girl. One moment she could recite Bible verses flawlessly, her voice sweet and obedient. The next, she would describe graphic sexual fantasies with unsettling detail, as if she had learned too much, too young. Even then, people sensed something was off. But no one intervened. No one asked questions. By the time Blanche was in her teens, she had learned something crucial: how to manipulate, how to present one face to the world while hiding another, how to survive in a house built on lies. And then, in 19 her father died suddenly. The doctors called it a heart attack. The family buried him without question. Life moved on. But decades later, when investigators exhumed Parker Kaiser's body as part of their investigation into Blanche, they found something chilling. Arsenic, elevated levels, unmistakable. The pattern had begun long before anyone realized it, and the girl who had once been a victim had learned somewhere in that dark childhood how to become something far more dangerous. In 1952, at 19 years old, Blanche Kaiser married James Napoleon Taylor. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect Christian couple. Blanche was active in the church, always volunteering, always smiling. James worked hard, provided for his family, and together they raised two daughters in a modest home in Burlington, North Carolina. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was different, tense, controlled. Friends who visited noticed that Blanche ran the household with an iron grip. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be her way. Then, in October 1973, James became ill. It started with stomach pain, then came the vomiting, relentless, violent, impossible to stop. His hands began to tremble. Numbness crept through his limbs. Within days, he could barely move. His body seemed to be shutting down, system by system. Doctors were baffled. They ran tests, searched for infections, considered every possibility. Finally, they settled on a diagnosis: heart attack. James Taylor died on October 7, 1973, at the age of 45. Blanche grieved publicly. She wore black to church. She accepted condolences with quiet dignity. And when the life insurance check arrived, she used it to pay off debts and stabilize her finances. She seemed relieved more than devastated. No one suspected anything. No one questioned the diagnosis. James was buried, and life moved on. But years later, when investigators exhumed his body as part of the growing case against Blanche, the forensic results were undeniable. Arsenic, lethal levels. The symptoms James had suffered, the vomiting, the numbness, the paralysis, weren't from a heart attack at all. They were classic signs of arsenic poisoning, and Blanche had been the one cooking every meal, caring for him through every agonizing day of his decline. Another husband, another sudden death, another insurance payout, and still no one had noticed the pattern. After James Taylor's death, Blanche didn't stay single for long. She had already been having an affair, one that had lasted for years, hidden beneath her perfect church lady facade. Raymond Reed was the store manager at the Kroger, where Blanche worked as a cashier. He was kind, dependable, and quietly in love with her. Their relationship was complicated, marked by jealousy, passionate reconciliations, and bitter arguments. But through it all, Raymond stayed devoted. By the early 1980s, they were inseparable. Blanche cooked for him constantly. She brought him lunches at work. She cared for him when he was tired. To everyone who knew them, she seemed like the perfect partner. Then, in early 1986, Raymond became ill. It started with nausea and weakness. Then came the numbness in his hands and feet. His legs began to fail him. Within weeks, he could barely walk. The paralysis spread upward, slowly consuming his body. Doctors were mystified. They ran test after test, searching for answers. Finally, they diagnosed him with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder that attacks the nervous system. Blanche never left his side. She visited him every single day at North Carolina Baptist Hospital. She brought him home-cooked meals, chicken, casseroles, desserts. The nurses remembered her as devoted, tireless, heartbroken. Raymond Reed died on October 7, 1986, exactly 13 years to the day after James Taylor. Blanche wept at his funeral. She accepted sympathy from friends and coworkers. And once again, she collected on life insurance policies Raymond had named her as beneficiary on. But years later, when investigators exhumed Raymond's body, they discovered the horrifying truth. Arsenic, massive amounts. And buried deep in his old hospital records, they found something even more damning. A toxicology test ordered in 1986 that had come back positive for arsenic poisoning. But the result had been filed away and forgotten. No one had followed up. Raymond Reed had been murdered. The hospital had known, and Blanche had walked free. Once Dwight Moore survived and investigators confirmed arsenic poisoning, everything changed. Detective Samuel Taylor knew they were looking at something far larger than a single attempted murder. He began pulling death certificates, medical records, insurance policies, anything connected to Blanche Taylor Moore. The pattern was unmistakable. Within weeks, investigators petitioned the courts for exhumation orders. 3 graves were open. First, Parker Kaiser, Blanche's father, dead since 1966. Then James Taylor, her first husband, dead since 1973. Finally, Raymond Reed, her lover, dead since 1986. The forensic results came back like hammer blows. Parker Kaiser, elevated arsenic levels. Suspicious, but inconclusive due to decomposition. James Taylor, lethal arsenic levels, homicide. Raymond Reed, massive arsenic levels, homicide. 2 confirmed murders, a third highly suspected, and 1 survivor who had come within hours of death. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Blanche's home. Inside a cabinet beneath the kitchen sink, they found it. Taro ant killer, an arsenic-based poison. She had purchased it months before marrying Dwight. When detectives brought Blanche in for questioning, she remained unnervingly calm. She smiled. She folded her hands in her lap. She quoted scripture. "The Lord knows my heart," she said softly. "I've done nothing wrong. These men were ill. I cared for them the best I could." But investigators saw through it now. They reviewed financial records and discovered the pattern. Insurance payouts, pension changes, inheritances. Every death had benefited Blanche financially. There was also the attention, the sympathy, the role of the grieving widow or devoted caregiver. Blanche thrived on it. The meals delivered to hospital rooms, the tears at funerals, the prayers at bedsides. And beneath it all was control. Blanche decided who lived and who died. She controlled their suffering, their decline, their final moments. The evidence was overwhelming, and for the first time in decades, Blanche Taylor Moore's carefully constructed mask was beginning to crack. On October 15, 1990, Blanche Taylor Moore walked into the Forsyth County Courthouse smiling. She waved to reporters. She greeted courtroom observers with a polite nod. She looked like a grandmother heading to Sunday service, not a woman on trial for murder. But the prosecution was ready. Over the next several weeks, they presented a case so overwhelming, so methodical, that it left no room for doubt. Forensic pathologists testified about arsenic levels found in Raymond Reed's body. Levels so high they could only have come from deliberate, repeated poisoning. Then came the witnesses. 53 people took the stand, Nurses, co-workers, hospital staff, all testifying to the same thing. Blanche had brought Raymond meals constantly during his hospitalization. Homemade dishes, desserts. She never missed a day. And every time she visited, his condition worsened. Medical records were entered into evidence. Financial documents showing insurance policies. Testimonies about her attempts to change Dwight Moore's pension beneficiary while he lay dying. And then came the moment Blanche's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Under cross-examination, prosecutors pressed her about the arsenic-based ant killer found in her home, about the pattern of deaths surrounding her, about her explanations that kept changing. Her voice wavered, her smile faltered. For the first time, the polite churchwoman seemed rattled. The prosecution painted a devastating portrait, a serial poisoner who hid behind Christian respectability, who used sympathy and devotion as cover, while slowly murdering the men in her life. The defense tried to introduce childhood trauma, mental instability, alternative suspects, but none of it stuck. The evidence was simply too strong. On November 14, 1990, the jury returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence: death. Blanche showed no emotion. She closed her eyes briefly as if in prayer, then opened them again. Calm, composed, almost peaceful. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, still wearing that faint, unsettling smile. Blanche Taylor Moore arrived at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in December 1990. She was 57 years old. She carried a Bible and a small bag of personal belongings, and she settled into her cell on death row as if she were moving into a quiet retirement home. Over the years, she became something of a legend within the prison walls. She wrote poetry. She composed songs. She counseled other inmates on faith and forgiveness. Guards and prisoners alike began calling her Miss Blanche, a title that carried both respect and an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew what she had done, but in person she seemed so gentle, so harmless. Then her health began to fail. Cancer, surgeries, radiation treatments. Her body, which had survived decades of secrets and lies, was finally breaking down. She spent weeks at a time in the prison medical unit, frail and weakening. But through it all, she never wavered in her story. "I didn't poison anyone," she would tell visitors, chaplains, anyone who would listen. "The Lord knows the truth. He will judge my accusers." Years passed, then decades. One by one, the people connected to her case began to die. Natural deaths, old age. The prosecutors who had convicted her. The detectives who had uncovered her crimes. The judge who had sentenced her. Even many of the inmates who had arrived on death row with her were gone, executed or dead from illness. But Blanche remained. Now in her 90s, confined to a wheelchair, her eyesight fading, she has become the oldest woman on death row in America. The state of North Carolina has never lifted her execution warrant. Legally, she is still sentenced to die by lethal injection. But the eerie question lingers. Will the state execute her before her body gives out naturally? And if they do, Blanche Taylor Moore will make history one final time. Today, Blanche Taylor Moore is 92 years old. She is wheelchair-bound, her vision nearly gone, her body ravaged by age and illness. But her death sentence remains active. The North Carolina Department of Corrections has quietly maintained its position. If Blanche is medically cleared for execution, she will die by lethal injection. The warrant has never been revoked. The sentence has never been commuted. Over the years, a small group of supporters has emerged. Advocates who argue that executing a woman in her 90s would be cruel and inhumane. They point to her frailty, her decades of model behavior in prison, her age. But the families of her victims see it differently. They remember the men who died slow, agonizing deaths. They remember the lies Blanche told, the prayers she said over hospital beds, while poison coursed through her victims' veins. To them, justice delayed is not justice denied, it's justice owed. And Blanche, she remains steadfast. God will handle my accusers, she has said in recent interviews. I have peace in my heart. The truth will be known in the end. But the truth has already been written in forensic reports, court transcripts, in the bodies of at least 2 confirmed victims, possibly more. Blanche Taylor Moore spent decades hiding in plain sight. She killed with a smile, grieved with perfect composure, and walked away from crime scenes with sympathy instead of suspicion. She was the devoted wife, the caring girlfriend, the church-going woman no one would ever suspect. And because of that, she got away with it for years. If the state of North Carolina ever sets an execution date, Blanche Taylor Moore will not take her final breath as a frail grandmother in a prison hospital bed. She will take it as the oldest serial killer ever executed in American history. What do you think? Has justice been served, or has it come too late? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into true crime history.